Hello, beautifuls. You are listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're talking about being on the embodied spiritual path, and what does that actually mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything, all the beauty and crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life? We'll be attempting to sort that out for ourselves here on the show, and we're just so glad you're listening in. In this episode, we are literally on an ego trip. We're talking all about the ego. What is it? Why do we have it? And how does it stand in our way? So many teachers argue that the ego is kind of the primary structure that prevents us from knowing our true nature. But are there benefits? And if we're born to know our own sacredness, why is it so hard to let go of the ego stories and just come into the present? As usual, this conversation will go on a journey covering psychology, anthropology, neuroscience, multiple spiritual traditions, and of course, our own experience. If you're enjoying the show, we're always delighted if you'd leave a review on iTunes or on our Facebook page, which is Bliss and Grit. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com and subscribe to our mailing list to hear updates on any upcoming events that we may have in the near future. One last note before we head into the conversation. As many of you already know, Brooke and I do have potty mouths, and so if there are kiddos around, feel free to pop in some headphones now. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I think this is actually going to be a fun one, Brooke. I don't know why, but I had a good feeling about it because maybe I'm into talking about the ego, which is what we're going to dive into today. So I like this quote by Reggie that I may read in different sections as we go through the talk because it's a little bit dense. And I think we should just put the quote somewhere in our resources or social media. But let me start off with the first line. In the formation of our conscious self, our ego, quote unquote, in Buddhist terms, we have walled off the great majority of what we have been, what we are, and what we can be. So there's this way that Reggie's pointing to something that we also speak about in psychology, actually, that we create this egoic self. We could also call it a persona. And sometimes in psychology, we'll use the term false self. And it's a constructed self. It may not be consciously constructed at all of the time, although sometimes it is, like in the case of a sociopath, they very, very clearly construct a conscious self. Or even someone may notice in their adolescence that they really thought about who they want to be. But other times it's more unconscious. It's more just created from ideas as we go through life and as we build these belief systems and narratives about what a good person would do, what a functional person would do, what an admirable or successful person would do. And essentially what we do is we constrict ways of being. We're ultimately in a process where we say, this is not good, this is not worthwhile, this is not ideal. So we wall off those parts of self or experience, as Reggie said. And then we say, and this is what a useful person would do, a good person would do, a successful person would do. And we kind of amplify these traits. And, we can see this in neuroscience, Brooke, because what I learned about neuroscience is that by the time you're 8 years old, your brain starts to go through a process that they call pruning, P-R-U-N-I-N-G, pruning. And what pruning is up until 8, your brain is just lit up with possibilities and pathways and everything it's ever learned, seen, and experienced. And as you become around the age of 8, your brain starts to prune off these pathways. It starts to limit them. It starts to really, essentially, crazily enough, decide who it's going to be and what life means and what life's going to be about. And it cuts off the pathways it thinks are not a match. So it's this crazy trip if you look at that, because most of who we truly decided we would be or we would believe was created by an 8-year-old's mind, an 8-year-old's functioning, right? Isn't that crazy?
It's amazing. And it makes perfect sense.
I mean, it's a trip because you go through your adult life thinking this is me, this is who I want to be. This is who I should be, right? Trying to live up to this image. And then slow down for a second and realize that those ideas were created by an 8-year-old's mind. And you've been holding true to them for so long.
And that's recreating them. Yeah. And just constantly recreating them in order to reinforce them. And I want to emphasize the point that you started with, although you just said a mouthful, so we'll get into a lot of, because there's so much good stuff in there. Mostly, really 99% of the time, this is unconscious. And we can bring it up to consciousness and then see it from a different perspective. And sociopaths in adolescence are great examples of conscious creation, but particularly by the time that we're adults. And like you said, these tracks got laid down at age 8. They just are who we are. It's the ultimate blind spot, right? Because who you are is just feels like you, just feels like home. And if there's not a practice of coming into stillness and coming into compassionate witness, and then you just really are solidly ego identified. And it's never questioned. It's just is who you are. And that's when we feel or we believe 100% without realizing that there's another option. We believe that we are almost victims of our own lives and our own life circumstance. Why does this keep happening to me? So we all have something or many things in our life that keep repeating. We all have things that are harder karmic categories and easier karmic categories, so it's why am I always so unlucky in love? Why am I always having such problems with money? Those are 2 of mine. Why am I so, these are things that you're more densely identified with your story of how it always goes for you. So there's this wonderful opportunity in an understanding of the ego, which we'll be doing more and more of today. Because like you said, Vanessa, there's a lot of density to this. And there's so much freedom in it. And for me, ego, it's one of those words, particularly when you identify as Buddhist-ish, it's used a lot. And I really thought I had an understanding of it for years. And it's this year that I'm starting to have an experiential understanding of it, even though I've been doing this work for a very long time and even doing work like Byron Katie's work for many years, which really helps you to see your stories. I'm at a layer right now where I'm really understanding experientially what the ego actually is. And it's not a thing. It's not one thing. It's a million tiny little hooks in a million tiny different little categories. And then there's layers and layers of veils with each story in each category. And so we have the opportunity to have a less fixed and less rigid, this is just who I am, this is just how it always goes for me, relationship to these things. And then all this fresh movement and experience in the form of what's happening in your real, actual life, meaning not just epiphanies when you're on the cushion, which happen too. It starts to come through and you start to realize oh my God, it was just this crazy mind trip that I was on for, only 30 whatever years. I'm doing the math from when I was 8, 30 something years, where I just went along with the story, not because I'm a bad person or that's shameful, but just because it was just me. And I had this very fixed idea of me-ness, not just about myself, but about every me in the world. I'm going to stop now. Pause. There's so many tributaries in this conversation that we could take,
I know. Well, and even that, the idea that we're in control, right? That this is me.
Yeah.
And that me thinks certain things and me knows certain things and me decides certain things, as if there is a part of us that's deciding that and thinking that on purpose or choosing that on purpose, kind of highlights one aspect of the ego, which is this control mechanism.
Yes.
So if you don't mind, Brooke, I think I'm going to read the rest of Reggie's quote, and we can because we can really, I think, start to look at the architecture of the ego, because you're describing like it has so much to it, these like million hooks. And so in a way, there's like, what is the ego? And then in a way, there's like, how does the ego operate and function? Like, how does it move within our system? Mm-hmm. And I think it could be useful to break that down. So let me read part 2 of Reggie Ray's quote, which is, so there are 3 aspects to this walling off, which we had described in the first part of the quote, the walling off of what we've been, what we are, and what we can be. Okay. There are 3 aspects to this walling off. First, we have established a more or less limited field of awareness. Second, this limited awareness is structured and defined by the particular concept or self-image we have of ourselves. And finally, it's maintained by the managerial aspect of the ego, whereby we act and react to whatever occurs in our never-ending efforts to establish, maintain, and secure our place in the world, quote unquote. So, let's just break that down again. So what Reggie is saying, and what Brooke and I are saying for ourselves as well, is the ego, the first thing it does is it limits the field of awareness. So, if you think about emptiness from a Buddhist concept, we talk about emptiness. Emptiness, oftentimes you'll describe it as like no thingness, right? And another way to look at emptiness is no thingness, as in full of possibility, full of potentiality, literally no limits, no identified or defined thing. So when we look at emptiness from that perspective as full of potentiality, we can see that the first thing the ego does in an attempt to create safety, because I guess, Brooke, we should talk about why we create an ego. So let's come back to that. Mm-hmm. But in an effort to create safety and a sense of control and predictability, the first thing the ego does is it limits the field of awareness away from all potentiality into this. I'm going to look at this. The second thing it does is the way that it selects, like how to limit the awareness, is it goes, this makes sense to me. This is who I am. Mm-hmm. This is my self-image. And this is how the world fits into my self-image. So I'm only going to see that. That's what the ego does. It filters information through the lens of what it thinks reflects its self-image and its sense of what the world is. And then the last thing it does is it manages it all. And it basically like screens what doesn't make sense. And then it establishes, maintains, and tries to essentially manipulate reality so that its place in the world that it's defined as this makes sense continues on. Did I say that in a way that resonates, Brooke?
Totally. So beautiful. So perfect. And I think it really starts to paint a picture of the downside of ego. And there are upsides of ego. I mean, anyway, the downside of ego is that it's limiting what we get to see in the world. The upside of ego is that it's limiting what we get to see in the world. So people who have fully awakened or enlightenment, all these words are so fucking tricky, but there's this period of time. It's not just like, ooh, and now it's yummy times all the time. Particularly directly after awakening, a lot of people describe that there's quite a bit of challenge in that, because actually what goes away is this thing, your ego, that's manipulating what you see. So now you just see. So now there's no veils to protect you. Now, what you realize also when you awaken is that you're God. So you don't worry about protection in the way that you used to worry about protection. You realize that everything's God. However, now suddenly, and even for people who aren't considered awake, all of us, who are on this path of, coming into deepening consciousness, let's call it, we come face to face, like as we pull these veils of the ego away, we come face to face with parts of ourselves that we don't want to see and parts of the world we don't want to see. We start to see the suffering of the world in maybe a much more vulnerable and tender way, which has upsides and downsides because we want to meet that suffering in a loving way as our hearts open. We see really a lot of the stories we told ourselves about us and how we're the good guy. Maybe not 100% true. We have to see some of the harder aspects of ourselves as well. So,
sorry, go ahead, Brooke.
I was just going to actually toss the ball over to you and say, probably talking about why we form an ego, which is in part just what the human brain does. Like you said, this pruning process that starts at age 8, like it's something that just kicks into gear. It's this evolutionary mechanism that we have. But how we develop it, and it's so connected to trying to feel safe in the world.
Yeah, I just want to say before I forget that even what you were just describing, we have to see aspects of ourselves that we may not like or appreciate, and we have to see aspects of life that may challenge us or be painful to see. Not only that, but remember the episode we did on joy phobia. We have to see aspects of ourselves that are great, aspects of ourselves that are beautiful, aspects of life that would blow our hearts open.
Yep.
And as we've discussed in that episode, even that can feel threatening to people. Yeah. It's crazy because we think of the term ego and we think ego as in like puffed up, like you have so much ego. That's not, of course, how we're using it, but it's funny that got like mashed up into our vernacular in that way.
It's strange.
Right. Like, who are you to think that about yourself? Now, really, though, what happens with the ego is it is literally just a constriction. It's not to make yourself necessarily better or worse. Yeah. It'll take whatever you decided at some point unconsciously will make you safe. And really, it's not even you decided. It's just whatever was decided in your system that would make you safe in your environment, whether it was to play big, play small, be tough, be cool, be vulnerable, whatever the case may be. It's your system decided this is the way to play it.
Yeah, and
this human incarnation
causes a lot of suffering. Obviously, that's the whole deal. But so for me, one of the ones that I'm really having to come to terms with and let go of is the ego identity of I am the person who suffers. So it's like we can pick that. We can form a whole identity around that. That's just one of my many hooks. But it's this hook that you would think, well, I don't want that. Of course I want to let go of that. No, actually, there's so many perks to it, right? So there are all these stories that hold the different layers of ego in place. And those, the story as the ego identity of I am a person who suffers is that makes me the good one and the person who's victimizing me or persons the bad ones. It makes me the saintly one and it makes me the one who can really lean in because I just really am so good at like meeting the suffering circumstances. So it's fascinating. Like we can create identity out of something really shitty that just keeps delivering us like, okay, you want more of this? Okay.
Here you go.
You decided that this is you? Okay. Like you can keep doing this. Or you can let go. And then you realize like, oh man, like the letting go has its own grief tied up in it. And I think that for me anyway, and I don't know if I'm kind of jumping too far ahead, but the thing that's been very, very useful for me is to realize that the safety pins that hold the veils of ego in place are always stories. Like I was saying, this makes me good. And so you can start to, instead of thinking about taking the whole veil away, like, oh, I'm just going to like let go of this whole identity I've had since I was probably 6 years old that like I'm the victim or I'm the one who suffers. I can look at the safety pins. It makes it more manageable. It's like one little piece at a time. one little layer at a time. And the safety pins are some story.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, of course, like one of the common ones a lot of us are stuck in, certainly I think I got attached to, was the unworthiness story.
Yeah, that's a big root
it's like,
one for all of us, for so many of us, not for all of us.
For so many of us, it's just the trance of unworthiness, and we're stuck in that identity. And like, who would I be if I didn't think I was unworthy? Well, I don't know. Would I be prideful? Would I accomplish things and then get attacked by people and like receive criticism? Would I threaten the people I loved? Right. So there's so much, as you said, like baked into what seems like unconscious perks of like why we keep the game going. Mm-hmm. I also have this I don't know, secret theory that I'm not talking about a lot, but I feel like, okay, so
I'm so excited
Ramdas
right now.
To say,
I'm like, this is not secret theory we haven't talked about yet.
I might have built that up too much, but we'll see. Ramdas has a great quote I always loved. He says, like, everybody you meet is God in drag.
No doubt. That's such a good one. He's so good.
So cool, right? And like, okay, so with this theory, the crazy part is, so are we, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right, that's obvious. We're God in drag. But we don't know consciously
until
that we're in drag, right? That's like we've talked about this, the layers of clothing and the false self. Okay. So then I'm thinking, but there is this aspect of self that knows. I mean, we can't lose truth. Truth is always there. So there's an aspect of self that knows that we're God in drag. And like, what if it's just having fun with its identity? Mm-hmm. Like, what if it's playing? Like the Hindus, I don't subscribe to Hinduism that often, but they talk about like lila and like life being a playground. And it's like, what if it's not only that we're attached to it because we're afraid to let go of our ego because we won't feel secure and life won't be predictable. What if there's just a certain bit of us that's like enjoying the game, enjoying the role?
Oh my God, I'm so in this right now. I'm really experiencing this. Like, as I let go of I'm the person who suffers identity, right? I'm like, oh my God, none of it was a big deal.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm talking, and I'm going to say some upsetting words now, but like abuse, assault, abandonment, like, the stuff that is hard about being a human. And as I let go of that identity, I'm like, oh my God, it was just playground time. Which isn't to say like I chose it or anything about shame or the getting off on terrible circumstances, or I would never wish it on anyone, and I wouldn't wish it on myself. It feels like hell. It feels like living in hell. But as you get a little spaciousness from it, and I'm really in the midst of this process, so I probably shouldn't talk about it too much, but there's this experience of like, oh my God, none of it is a big deal. It's all okay. It's just, like you said, playground time.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I get that feeling for myself too, but it's just like an itch. It's just like an itchy feeling as like some revelations are coming into my system of like, there's like, maybe I just want to try this on for size this lifetime, and I want to play with it. And if we're all source, then source is doing this, and it's doing it for some reason that may be beyond our conscious understanding at this point, but it's trying things on for size. I mean, it's choosing the form of an identity for some reason, because, as you and I have talked about in earlier episodes, I never sat down and was like, you know what I think I'm going to be? I think I'm going to be a really insecure person who dives into suicidality a lot. That sounds super.
That's what I want. Yeah.
That's just what got created, right? That's how my system moved. And you could say I'm shaped by my environment, but other people in my environment were not shaped exactly the same way. And, it's just, that's when we start to look at source. That's when we start to understand that even though we have this ego managerial control tower aspect of ourselves, there's something else really moving us and animating us. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's come back to the ego formation. It is interesting. I mean, we can say it very succinctly and say that we form an ego because the idea of a completely unpredictable, spontaneous reality feels like overwhelming and scary as shit. And that the one thing we seem to crave as humans in this like wild existential universe is something we can predict, something we can understand, because that can create safety, like literal physical safety. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, after that, psychological safety. And I think, you know, everyone listening to this podcast is already pretty smarty pants. And we're all pretty geeky about these things. So we get that. We can implicitly get that, like, the ego is a managerial system that was created in our human evolution. At least we can think from like a scientific standpoint to keep us safe. It uses information from the past to project into the future so that we don't repeat problems and we can keep ourselves physically, first and foremost, physically safe. And then, of course, this wonderful benefit of thinking we can keep ourselves psychologically safe, which never, ever pans out.
No, or
ever.
that it's going to keep us from recreating problems when in fact it
completely
relies on perpetuating the problems. Because if we don't have our identity, if it doesn't keep happening, we don't get to have that identity. And if we don't have that identity, that's fucking scary.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, you know, the ego is only really capable since the ego is so bound up in this fear-based survival mode thinking, it's really only capable of working the way the survival brain works, which is to use the past to predict the future.
It's not our smartest part.
No, it's not creative and it's not evolving. So it falls into what Sigmund Freud used to call the repetition compulsion. It just repeats itself and repeats itself. And we think we're not, you know, like I think when I married my ex-husband, he seemed nothing like my father on paper at all. And then I totally wound up feeling like I was walking on eggshells like I used to when I was a child with my father. It's like we think we're not, but we totally are repeating things because we're all grabby hands and like scaredy pants. And I like to call it clumsy hands. It's like we're trying to be like not like we are, but we're so nervous that we're going to be like we think we're going to be, that we got like clumsy hands and we create it.
Yeah.
So anyway, you know, Reggie also would talk about the anthropological development of the ego and how it's like if we go really far back and we're in these tribal units and we're connected to nature and we're really into this like larger collective consciousness, there was less need for the ego. That over time, though, as the, you know, Homo sapiens are fighting off the Neanderthals and different things, we had to start to develop this kind of smart identity of separation so we can strategize and we could really defend ourselves against these larger, more physically powerful opponents. So that he thinks like anthropologically, that's how the ego first started to form. And then, you know, over time, as we keep moving away from tribal, we keep moving away from collective, we keep moving away from nature-based connectivity, and into the world of independence, that the ego has just taken a greater and greater foothold in our system so that where historically it was really meant to be a tool, currently it's become our whole way of functioning.
Yeah, our whole operating system and worldview.
Yeah, our whole operating
is
system.
Of separateness, separate lumps everywhere.
Yeah. And of course, in our cultures, you know, and maybe for many of you listening, the more westernized you've gotten, the more we're valuing independence, the more we're like using these ego identities to kind of move, because we're moving away from this sense that I'm actually not independent. You know, the ego in a way is a complete figment. That's why we call it the false self. It makes me think that I, Vanessa Scotto, in this body, in this form, am choosing my destiny. I am separate and I'm mighty and I'm creating all of my life choices. There, we get comfort in the idea of free will and choice and all of these different things. And really it's kind of counter to this idea that source is choosing and that actually I'm a part of a whole, like my mirror neurons are mirroring Brooks and my environment, and I'm part of a collective unconscious, and I have intergenerational trauma, and that all of these things are moving me. There's not just this static Vanessa, which is actually what neuroscience finds, is there is not a managerial self. We are actually a collective of multiple selves that step in and like move things, never mind the fact that we are so interconnected with our environment, you literally couldn't split hairs to know who is Vanessa and what is outside. Does that all make sense?
Absolutely. And I would like to say that we can play with this stuff in the realm of the intellect, and that's very helpful, so I'm not saying that that's not helpful. And what we're going for, sorry about the honking horn outside, if anyone can hear it. I'm at my office today. New Haven is such a quiet place. What we're going towards, what we're moving towards is a felt sense experience of this. And I think this is where Judith Blackstone's work becomes, so many people's, but because you and I are training with Judith, it becomes so helpful, because these concepts are really just concepts until we get a glimpse of an experience of it. For me, I had what was for sure the most profound, except for when I was 7, which I won't go into all that, but other than when I was 7, the most profound realization when I was meditating on retreat, just like a good cliche would have it. And I could see myself from inside my body, and all I could see were my arms raising and lowering. So there wasn't anything interesting to see. It was just my arms raising and lowering. And I realized it was like, oh my God, it wasn't me raising and lowering my arms, me, Brooke, the ego identity. I realized, and what the words were that came was, oh my God. And it was hilarious to me. Oh my God, I'm not a person. And then the other phrase was, I've never done anything in my whole life. And it felt like the most hilarious and most liberating thing in the world that I had ever thought I was a person and that I had ever done anything. It was just this glimpse that it's just God moving me. And that glimpse has not stayed. I'm not an awakened person, but it's informed and informing what unfolds. And so having some kind of embodied experience, and that's where these somatic practices are so gorgeous, because it's the only thing that trips the wire of your intellect and your ego identity wanting to show you everything and make it all whatever it wants to make it for you, and it can talk about it, can seem really smart. And it's like, well, hey, if I understand intellectually that we're all God, then what's the deal? I'm enlightened. It's like, no. We can understand that intellectually all day long. It doesn't mean jack shit unless we know that we're operating from that place. So maybe we want to talk about Judith's work of that a little bit. What do you think?
Yeah. And just to add to what you're saying, I think there's a certain amount that can be done through inquiry as well.
Yeah.
Kind of the whole zhuzh of psychology is to make the unconscious conscious so that what you can't see doesn't keep ruling you. And there's a certain amount that through inquiry, whether it's spiritual inquiry, like a lot of teachers will use inquiry, like Lucille Francis is just really an inquiry-based kind of practitioner. A lot of really great ones, or through things like psychology or Byron Katie's work, whatever it is. You use these processes of inquiry, and it's like you start to have these epiphanies, like, oh, yes. I'm not that. I'm not that. Oh,
and that's
not
the
real.
moment, right? Is the that inquiry gets you to the same place of like, oh my God, you just have this moment of the soap bubble popping.
Yeah. So let me introduce the concept of the false self, and then we'll go into Judith a little bit. So, in psychology, we use this term, the false self. You'll see it through like Winnicott and many, many psychoanalysts actually even. So basically it's your persona. It's this identity, right? Like I am this, I am not that. And it's this tunnel vision for who you can be. Now, the problem with the false self is it can be very successful in our world, actually, right? You can create a wonderful persona that people really applaud, mm-hmm. or you could be the foil and you could be the worst and, everyone can feel sympathy for you, whatever the case may be. But no matter what, it's still false. And you know it. And that is one of the biggest, I think, dilemmas that we have. We feel sometimes unreal. We can feel empty. We can feel like we're faking it. We can worry that if they only found out, like if they only knew us, they'd really find out who we were. I had that. Mm-hmm. these to me, I've come to see all as hallmarks of a false self operating and not living from your internal truth and your internal alignment. Maybe better to say, not living from a place of interconnectivity, right? So we have these false selves. I had one for sure. I still have some. It's like it dissolves over time in greater and greater increments. And we move from there, and then we feel like empty or ungrounded or dissatisfied, or like we're not being true, or like something's missing. We have all these different experiences. So we think, well, you know what I'll do? I'll just build up my false self more. If only I was even better, if only I spoke even better, if only I had a better boyfriend, if only I had a better job, you know, we just keep working at the level of where the problem is.
Yeah.
Right?
Out there.
The out there. And it's really just us trying to make an even better false self, because we don't understand that that was the root of us feeling like something is empty. So then what's the antidote? So, you know, in Taoism, they talk about a concept of suchness, like the uniqueness that is Brooke, the suchness. It's not a contrived state. It's just who, if I let down every bit of my guard, every bit of my I should, every bit of I have to, it's who I would be. Actually, Alan Watts tells this great story. It's from Nietzsche. It's actually like a parable from Nietzsche, but Nietzsche talks about how, like, at first in life, everybody's like a camel, and the camel is like pile it on my back world. I can handle this burden. I'm so strong. Like, whatever you've got, I'm going to like load up on me. That's the first stage of which we meet the world. Then the camel, like becomes a lion, and the lion in this desert sees this dragon, and the dragon is covered in these plaques on it that each time it says, thou shalt, like you should, all over the dragon. And if you slay the dragon of I should, you actually become a baby. And then the world is yours again, and it's full of potentiality, right? And I just thought, like, that's it. We're all facing up against this part of ourselves, this ego managing system that says it should, you should, they should, right? And to free yourself from that, the Taoists would say, would be to move spontaneously. And they would call it self-so, like self-so. And to be self-so is to just move how you move. Move how you fucking move. You can't even predict it. You don't know how you move. Reggie talks a lot about this, and I've experienced this with clients. It's where I'm the most self-so. It's like very little Vanessa, very much just like, I don't know what's going to come through in this co-created moment, you know? So really the goal in this, like, if we were to like say it out loud, is to become self-so, is to become spontaneous. It's the exact opposite of how can I create a better self, right? And you and I talk about fix it. So let me read a little bit of what Judith would say. She says, the false self is bound up in our mind, energy, and body. It does not go away when it is denied. The rigid distortions of the false self become over time static patterns of tension in the body that literally trap us in their limiting patterns. They are densities in the tissue of our body. These densities obscure our realization of fundamental consciousness. They block our access to the vertical core of our body, and they obstruct our spontaneous direct experience of life. They keep us reacting to the world as we reacted out of what was then necessity in our family of origin. So chew on that, Brooke Thomas.
Oh, I'll chew on that.
Oh boy.
No, I just think, I mean, it's one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to people like, we keep calling him Reggie, by the way. For those of you who are new to the show, Reggie Ray, who we consider to be one of our primary teachers.
Get with it. It's Reggie Ray.
Reggie Ray. And Judith Blackstone, is because for me, as a body person, and everyone's going to have their different best way in, but for me, that has been tremendously useful, because then I get to have these felt experiences. So for example, with Judith, she has that meditation she takes you through where you get very, very, very deeply embodied to a degree that you didn't know was possible, which, I've been in this field and working on my own body healing for about 20 years. So, I've had a lot of embodiment work, but you get deep, deep, deep in there. And then you have the experience that your body and the space of the room, of the world, of the other people around you are continuous. Now, when you actually get to feel that, it's one of these glorious, and you used the word ecstatic, which was perfect, almost ecstatic feelings of not being bound by the rigid false self. And like, oh my God, I'm not what I have thought I was. I'm not this individual person with this storyline. And also I am, like you said, nothing's ever going to be one way in this realm, folks. So that's how that goes. But like you said, if we remove all of the false self stories and beliefs and operating systems, what's left is something that actually is fundamentally you, the truest flavor of you that gets kind of channeled through in this really flow of source, flow of truth, beautiful way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what we're talking about, like what Judith identified and Reggie says all the time, and you and I are talking about, is that we talked about this in the karma episode, is that it's hard for us to have a direct experience of life. There's a threat in that. Or at least there's a threat to our ego in that.
Yeah.
And so we resist it, right? And this is just one way that we resist it, by creating an identity, right? But then ultimately it's blocking this deep sense of connection to ourself and connection to our world, which is what we really want. We have this innate drive for wholeness, right? So by doing these different kinds of practice, whether it's inquiry or meditation or going within or whatever you do, Tai Chi, Qigong, they're all different roads to recognize truth, which is the realization of what you really are, which is a deep, deep sense of connection, right? So the important thing to kind of remember, I guess, is twofold, is that as I've done this for myself, as I've done these practices, as I've kind of popped some of these soap bubbles of my narratives, I feel more and more real, whole, true, myself, at one. It's not that I don't have these neurotic thoughts sometimes and I don't have storylines. I definitely do. I still move from fear at different moments. You all know that because I talk about it. But like we've said in other episodes before, I feel whole. I feel present. I don't feel ever like I'm faking something or something's missing or something's wrong or somehow things are empty ever anymore. And I think that's the joy of it all. That's why it's worth going through the direct experience and sitting with observing the managerial aspects of the ego, which is really crazy to see how we manipulate our environment. Really crazy.
And our whole fucking view of everything.
Oh, God. And like, we do things to people, even you people who are good people out there, you're a good person. I'm a good person. Like, we manipulate people with how we language stuff, with what we say, with what we don't say, with what we do.
Their identity is one of the most harmful.
Oh, God, we do crazy
Talk about wolf in
stuff.
sheep's clothing. And that's, me. Like, I'm one of those people.
Yeah, you're definitely not the most harmful. It's just
no. But like, it's the
it's very sneaky.
Yes.
It's very sneaky. And that's
sneaky
really,
to the person doing it and sneaky to the people receiving it. So it's sneaky all around.
Yeah, very sneaky. There's a lot of Houdini about the good person because it's like, how could you judge me? I'm such a good person. So it's like,
I know what's best. Just do what I want you to do so I can puppeteer the whole world.
Exactly. So it's a very sneaky one. But like, do remember this. It's like part of what this Judith quote was getting at is that by the time we form these ego identities, by the time we're 8, and then like we move through life with it for 20, 30, 40 years, however old you are, there are tensions in our body. It changes the way we move. It changes the way we breathe, literally.
Yep.
Literally. And this goes back really even in the psychoanalytic world. Wilhelm Reich was talking about this years ago. Alexander Lowen. Oh my God. If you want to read about psychology and the body, read Alexander Lowen. Never mind that Buddha was saying it and that these great modern day teachers are talking about it and Zen was talking about it. This is like, you can find this sprinkled throughout, this idea. So it like gets stored in our body. So not only do we have a certain way of thinking when the ego is managing, and therefore a certain way of driving our choices, but it also impacts how much we can move or not move, how we like walk, how we speak, how we breathe, how we stand. And that's why this all then starts to get mirrored into our reality. And then what our ego decides is real becomes real, because it's flavoring everything.
Yeah, I'd kind of like to end with a great story I just heard Mooji tell. I was watching a video of a satsang with him, and I just feel like it's kind of illustrating what we're talking about in a hilarious way. So he had somebody at satsang, means that people come together with a spiritual teacher and they're able to ask questions or talk about what's going on in their own lives. And then, spontaneously the teacher responds to those things in a way that helps them to see with more clarity. So this man was asking Mooji, so sincere, you could tell he was very identified in a very suffering kind of way. Like everything irritated him. Like people snore and people talk too loud. People chew their food, like that, one of those kind of personalities. Mm-hmm. And he said to Mooji, he had enough self-awareness to say this. He said, I kind of feel like a child in a children's story who's saying, I want to Mooji, basically, deliver enlightenment to me. I want my ice cream cone and I want you to give it to me now. And I don't want to wait. I want the ice cream cone now. And Mooji said, well, okay, it's all happening right now. So I'm over here and I'm holding your ice cream cone. You can have your ice cream cone. It's right here. And he said, and you come over to me and you're holding a ball, a children's toy, a ball. And I say, well, you have to put down the ball or else you won't be able to pick up the ice cream cone. And he said, no, I don't want to put down the ball. Well, it doesn't work like that. You're going to have to put down the ball. And he says, well, that ice cream cone is very small. The ice cream cone on the poster over there, it's very big and it's beautiful and it looks amazing and it has 4 scoops and this one only has 2 scoops. I want it to look like the one on the poster. And he says, well, that one doesn't exist. That's just the poster. This is the ice cream cone. It's right here. I'm offering it to you.
Put down the ball.
Put down the ball. And so that's obviously our ego. And I think that it's such a funny and beautiful and useful story. And it's helpful just to think about throughout the day, what is the ball that I don't want to put down right now? Because I want my ball and I want my ice cream cone, but I'm not willing to put down the ball to get the ice cream cone. Oh, and P.S. the ice cream cone should look like what I want it to look like and not what it actually looks like.
Oh, girl. Now I'm so excited you ended with this story. First of all, it's beautiful. It's a great illustration. And second of all, it sets us up to talk about the poster.
Yeah, let's talk the poster next time. Except we say that all the time and then we don't follow through.
No, we're going to do it this time, I think.
Yeah, let's talk about the poster. Yeah, bitches.
Coming soon. Thank you so much for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. If you go to the website and scroll down, you'll see each episode's separate post and the resources are in there. You can also come join the conversation on social media. Instagram and Facebook are where we're most readily available, and we're Bliss and Grit at both of those spots. If you want to support the show farther, please go ahead and write us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or on our Facebook page. We also have a new subscribe form on the website, by the way, which is blissandgrit.com, and you can sign up there if you want to stay in touch with all the goodies we have brewing for the community. It's been so great hearing from all of you by email or on Instagram or through your reviews. It warms our heart, and in a lot of ways, it helps other people find the show. And by the way, if technology isn't your thing, but you are enjoying the show, well, then we appreciate you just telling your friends who you think it might resonate with. Huge gratitude to all of you who have already written reviews like Chelsea Morris, Venezia B, S. Locke, Nixter Star Live, and so many more. And I just want to read one from Sarah A. Awake. If you're on this journey called life and you can hear, you should give this podcast a listen. It's brilliant, fascinating, raw, and beautiful. Thank you so much, Sarah A. Awake. And thanks to all of you for listening in. We'll be back next week.